Yeah, I don't know why this week was just intense and busy. I'm glad it's Friday. Yeah, I don't know if that helps much these days, but anyway, I'm for some reason
What's
glad
a
it's
Friday? What's a
What
Friday?
day is it? Where am I?
What's a weekend? Yeah. I know. I've never been into um, meditation or anything like that, right? So, but I know that there is this such an amazing viral video on TikTok in Ukrainian about. So basically, that's an attempt to create a perfect meditation video for Ukrainians, and it has like nice music, and the voiceover says like, imagine, you're on the border, on the eastern border of Ukraine, and it's Kharkiv Oblast, and what you're seeing is a massive ocean of Stepan Bandera, and you're on the beach at the eastern border, and all our borders with Russia is just a beautiful ocean beach, and it helps. I mean, it's ridiculous, but it's so effective.
Yeah. One day. Ukrainian, what is it? Meditation / ASMR or whatever it's called.
Yeah, it's also a very Ukrainian thing to try to joke about stuff that we unfortunately have to endure and process through every day. And one of our Ukrainian Spaces family members, Alekshin, posted today extremely heartbreaking message. Actually, for all those people still trying to lecture us how to negotiate inside the situation. So he wrote, my high school mate died today after a Russian bomb hit his cafe. His mom survived. And my middle school teacher was shot in the head by a Russian soldier trying to evacuate her daughter, and she's now in coma. There's this new level of grief we have to live with every fucking day, Oleg writes on his Twitter. So I really felt through all of this because there's so much stuff that you have to go through, and unfortunately, it's going to be much more of it in coming weeks or months. But nevertheless, we all have to do something to make sure that any sacrifices are there just tiny bit respected, and in a way that part of this job is making sure that people do not forget that this kind of tragedy, this genocide in the middle of Europe, is happening every second of every day. And, our job is make sure that nobody forgets it, right?
Yeah, which is why we're here as well, to talk about Ukraine and elevate even more Ukrainian voices. And I'm so happy that we, Maksym, never run out of new guests to join us every week, which I think is just testament to how much there is to talk about, and how many amazing people and experts there are in Ukraine to talk about Ukraine itself.
For our sponsors, we're having growing committed community of sponsors on Patreon. And thanks to you, this show remains 100% independent, volunteer, and listener supported. And it wouldn't be possible to go on without you. And actually, we're happy to announce that we're really fine at the point where we finally can find some help and hire some help to make sure that our at least social media game is stronger than it is. But nevertheless, we need more of support. So please go to our Patreon page, become our sponsor. You get a lot of extra bonus stuff, but most importantly, as a sponsor, you get a front seat at Ukrainian Spaces broadcasts, and you can ask your questions in person or through comments with a priority. So yeah, a lot of cool stuff. And I think we're ready to move to our featured Ukrainian. And Yevhenii, are you with us right here?
Yep. Hi, everyone.
Hey, Slava Ukraini.
Hello, Slava.
So, Yevhenii, I'm super excited to have you. You're one of my literally most favorite people on Twitter and beyond in terms of thoughts and perspectives you always share. But we have a golden rule on Ukrainian Spaces that we never introduce our guests and feature Ukrainians and allow them to have that space to introduce themselves the way they want it. So please share with everyone else who you are, what you do, and what your life has been since the genocide started.
I'm a historian, and as I like to say, I'm an accidental sociologist, though I'm not claiming to be a trained sociologist. I'm a trained historian by vocation. I'm a at the moment I'm a graduate student in history at the Yale University. Also, European Studies Fellow at the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies, also at Yale, and also a member of a couple organizations doing historical work and analytical work with regard to social implications of war. But most importantly, I'm a native of Luhansk for God only knows how many generations. At least since the mid-19th century, my family resides in Luhansk. And this war, this genocide started for me literally 8 years ago. In 3 days, it will be a 8th anniversary of my beginning of my captivity by Russians. So when I was took to the basement, as we called it back then, and I was experiencing this war firsthand since 2014, and was trying to deal with it on the social side, basically since then.
Can I ask you a bit of personal question right away? As a person from Luhansk and from Donbas, and seeing everything that is happening today, and how do you feel about the missed opportunities that the world had when it comes to dealing with Russia since the invasion of 2014? Because, I mean, personally, I feel guilty every day, because I know so many people from Donbas and from occupied territories who have been telling us that this needs to be resolved now, and the occupied territories should be liberated. If that won't happen, they would say, before this will spread. And they were right. And I feel a bit guilty that we tried to normalize it for so many years, even Ukrainians, notwithstanding the rest of the world. So how do you feel today, basically understanding that people from the eastern Ukraine, from Donbas, they were right all this time?
For the last 8 years, we was observing desired silence about the war, both inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine. I think beginning late 2015, from my perspective, late 2015, the whole conversation about war was happening through the Minsk Agreement and through any way possible to prolong this inevitable next stage of hot armed conflict, as international humanitarian law define it. Though, from the perspective of a person from Donbas, this has always been a experience of being the crazy person in the room. It's always been a person who, at the same time, makes jokes about war, because as for now, and you mentioned this, it's like for all of the Ukrainians, it became a routine experience. It became a routine process of digesting the horrors of war. People are getting used for everything, and we know this. We knew this kind every person, every historian knows that's like people are doing more or less the same stuff, but in different circumstances. Though that's why the history does not repeat itself, but people just do the same stuff. Results are different. So at the end of the day, we are looking at the situation when for 8 years there was a very small portion of people who was not always even crying out. There was just a usually a numb monuments for displacement, for the humanitarian crisis. I think about 4 years ago, I gave a lecture in the new place of Izolyatsiya in Kiev, I-zone, about blockade of Luhansk. And because for almost 60 days, for 55 days, Luhansk was without electricity, without water, without sewage, without connection to the outer world.
In 2014, you mean,
in 2014, right? August 3rd till late September. And like I was there with like my whole family, and this situation was never properly described, as was never the experience of IDPs properly described. Just last year, I started writing essay, which I hope to finish soon and remaster this because it is about the experience of IDPs. And the punchline, the last argument of the essay, its larger piece, is that though we had to went through horrendous endeavor of bureaucracy and of the state and the people who didn't want us to recognize through the ostracism, through the the all kinds of xenophobia, institutional xenophobia at the first place. Mm-hmm. But we all learned how to deal with this. And my punchline when I wrote the first draft before February 21st was that when the next stage will come, we will be the people who will figure out the best ways to deal with this first, because we already been there.
But in a way, it's, of course, like, you know, as you said, for people who were internally displaced from 2014, and now many are internally displaced again, it's something, you know, as we keep saying, war affects different people in different ways. And I think that's super important to acknowledge whenever we do speak about Ukraine and whenever we do talk to Ukrainians, that, you know, war has affected different people differently, and particularly people who have already gone through this once. It must be really hard to go through it again, or maybe easier, as you said. You're the first ones who know how to deal with it.
It is actually, well, we don't have any data yet on this, because from anecdotal evidence I get from different friends of mine, etc., the readiness to take off is there, and it's easier. Though for those who losing their housing, for those who whose apartments and houses were destroyed, it's basically re-traumatization.
Yeah.
So yes, those people are more capable. It's like when pandemic started 2 years ago, I was telling few of my friends who was panicking and like didn't know what to do, and I started to coaching my friends on like how you survive in the dire circumstances. And for me, that was a warlike experience. And I then realized it's like I feel myself more safe in those in those extreme points. And because this experience roll you back to the memories of the horrors of war, and you just mobilize for that. So This experience is obviously invincible inside us, but it's also it's also like a rust, right, growing on us and making us not that sensible for lots of the problems, and lots of IDPs are just for years was trying to blend in new communities and just pretend their life before 2014 would never happen.
Maksym obviously has that massive thread on colonialism in general, Russian colonialism in general, covering loads of different places around the world in relation to, you know, the exercise of Russian colonialism in those places. But you have, I think Maksym pinned your tweet on Donbas in particular. You know, something that frustrates me a lot of the time with Western coverage is that there's like this weird in a lot of people's perception, not dichotomy, but like the West versus Russia, and everything in between seems like this big black box with no history of its own, that everything revolves around other big sort of events that have happened in Russia and in the US. But I wanted to ask you, and I know this will probably take a very long time and we can have a whole lecture with you on this, but for our audiences who are here and who for the first time are learning a bit about Russian colonialism in Donbas, what would be some of the main things that you would ask people to learn or know about why we are in the situation we are today in relation to the practices of Russian colonialism?
Well, again, the problem here is basically bifold. First thing is a problem of perception of Ukrainian statehood. Lots of the Westerners, and sometimes they're very educated people, but they're not historians, or they're not people of social sciences and humanities. They're like, I don't know, architects, and they have a basic attitude towards Ukraine as a terra incognita, as a state appeared after 1991, and honestly, it is actually the case. So, like, to study few years of Ukrainian statehood after the dissolution of Russian Empire, it's actually, to be honest, failed attempt for various reasons. But this perception is first perception is built on that, and secondly, the problem is that the question of land and the perception of land and the territories, it's heavily dictated by Russia. So in these circumstances, you go to Germany, and those people whom you will tell that you are from Ukraine, 6 months ago, 12 months ago, people of the age of, I don't know, our parents would say that, this is Russia, or this is part of Russia. And they have this certain level of semantic legitimacy, because, like, in their minds, Ukraine is a fallout territory from Soviet Union. Soviet Union, in their perception, equals Russia, and this is the biggest problem in the, I would say, in area studies for those historians, sociologists, etc., who study region. That's people from social sciences and humanities come to study, I don't know, Ukraine or Georgia or Turkmenistan through first learning Russian. And then they go to Ukraine and they see Ukraine or Georgia or Turkmenistan through the lenses of a Russian speaker who learned additional language, sometimes, not always. And this is the biggest problem, because then those people who learn about this territory, some of them becoming those people, as you mentioned, pundits, who will explain to Western audience that the nature of the conflict, or the nature of the war, or the nature of the humanitarian issues, or who Ukrainians are, or what the borscht is. So like it's this twofold problem of the perception of the state and perception of the territories, and the additional asterisks on this of the people who actually learn about this. And if you go to the problem of what people should know, well, heck, people should not know. They should read books, or they should read some people who actually study the region. And you mentioned this crazy long Twitter thread about the history of Donbas, which is heavily inaccurate in lots of places. It actually took me about 10 days to write the thing, and about 12 books to take from Yale Library. So the thing is, the first thing everybody should know, that's it's basically Ukrainian territory being a cradle of the whole civilizational appearance of Eastern Slavs, of Eastern Slavic nations. And basically, if we want to claim some dominances, it's Ukrainian-based dominance. But if you talk about the territories of Donbas, of this wild steppe, because the very important thing about Donbas, everybody have to realize in the first place, that Donbas itself doesn't exist. It's a myth created by first of all, Soviet propaganda. So it's economical region with no particular particular identity, or particular culture, or particular language.
You mean identity that was constructed by colonialism and the narratives of Soviet colonialism or Russian colonialism?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So first, it's very blunt and simple economical colonization. So the territories were sold out, rented out, to be specific, by the Russian imperial government to the huge Western companies. That's where we have all of this story about John Hughes, founding father of Donetsk, Karl Gascoigne, founding father of Luhansk. We have Belgians building Lysychansk. We have Belgians building Konstantinovka. We have French and Italian and whatever businesses coming, also British business coming to Mariupol to build the factory. Not just to build factory. Mariupol steel plant was the first ever in human history planned steel pipe, which was deconstructed in Portsmouth and taken by the sea to Mariupol and assembled again. This basically was first transfer of the industry in the humankind history. So this is the whole territory was simply rented out to big businesses. Imagine I don't know, today some huge corporations, Amazon, building warehouses in Donbas, and local people just come to work because usually there are always poor people somewhere in some villages who have too many kids or had few bad years. And for instance, my great-grandfather was one of those people who was, since he was 14, coming from nearby village to Luhansk to work on a locomotive building factory.
I'm now going to pin a documentary that actually has English subtitles, which is called Euro Donbas, and it's an amazing documentary done by one of my colleagues on exactly what you're saying in terms of a legacy, European legacy of why there are Belgian neighborhood architecture in Donbas, why there are cities that were built by French and other European architects, is something that then was appropriated by Russia, saying, well, this is Russia built this, which it's not the fact.
It's another side of the colonial history. So basically, it's like saying, oh, New York was built by Dutch people. Yes, of course, but they were colonizers. Was the same thing. Like we have those beautiful buildings. We have like Polish nobility was sent to Donbas in large numbers after two uprisings in 19th century, and we have like few mentions in Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast of the Polish nobility. They're small, but they're like very specific Polish names after those. So basically, you have those Europeans coming to use the cheap labor and build their steel pipes, coal mines, etc. But essentially, you have Ukrainian villages. You have basically population who come there, first of all, to work, and then by the growing of the economy, more people from the neighboring regions are coming, and we have the first Russian imperial census of 1887. We have about 25% of the people living in districts which now comprise Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast, who were born outside of Katerinoslav Gubernatoriate, which it was Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast was part of. It doesn't mean that all of those people came from, I don't know, Urals. Mostly those people came from Kharkiv or Poltava.
Other Ukrainian regions.
There of course were like it's all mishmash of nations. Of course, there were, as I mentioned, there were Serbians, there were people, there were Moldavans, there were Jews in a large number. Jews usually comprised about 10% of the cities, and the whole Donbas started to crystallize as urban culture center. So the whole identity, which bearing right now the myth of Donbas, it's an urban myth. It's a myth about restless urbanization, and I can say that's like, even for me being a historian of the place, it's still striking. For instance, when I moved from Luhansk to Lviv to study to make my to get my master's, it was odd for me to hear that somebody is coming from the place where it's about like 10,000 people population, and they call this place a city.
Yeah,
and
but for me, as a person from Eastern Ukraine, it's quite the same. Was always shocking when to see the rest of the country, especially the western part of Ukraine, that is more rural, and compared to our eastern part, that is like city after city after city merging into cities. This just was really strikingly different.
Yes, absolutely, and this is always was like, and this is became a centerpiece of the Soviet mythology. There are a few wonderful, if you again about those who interested in understanding the process, like the whole epistemology, the process of understanding of the region, and not Donbas at large, the whole post-Soviet region. There's a wonderful larger article by Professor Stephen Kotkin from Princeton called The Mongolian Commonwealth, where he criticizing the whole changing of those university centers for Soviet studies into whatever. They became Eastern European studies, Eurasian studies, Eastern European and Eurasian, Russian studies, whatever. But you go to Russian studies, and there are people who study Kazakhstan there. So this is the large problem also.
Can I also ask you, because one of the last actually tweet in this thread, and literally I would say that if you're a foreigner and if you ever say Donbas coming from your mouth, I think you shouldn't be doing that without at least reading this thread, but even more so. But the last tweet in this, I feel extremely powerful message that you send out, and it says, the steppe east of Ukraine was an early modern frontier that Ukrainians have long settled. Resemblance to the Wild West can only be attributed to the fact that in the end, an empire arrived and sought to exterminate the native population. And actually, I wanted to ask you about this lost history. I mean, most of the cases it's about eastern southern Ukraine, where there are hundreds and hundreds of years of history of either indigenous populations or Ukrainians living, settling in those parts of the country. But it's been erased by Russian colonialism, especially in recent years, by claiming that this was no one's land. And when this genocide started, I think this question became even more prominent because the whole reasoning for this genocide stems basically with a similar argument that it's been no man's land, and then Russians came and it became Russian. So yeah, if you want to like highlight for other foreigners how exactly those hundreds of years of history were missed or erased by Russian colonialism.
There's not. It wasn't just erased. It was blended in. It was made into whatever weird omelet of these stories. So here the whole colonization process of the east or the Ukrainian steppes was a absolutely normal process of population of the territories. It was for a long time. It was a territory of the particles of the former Mongolian empires, but particularly of Crimean Khanate and Nogai, small Nogai Khanate, and Ukrainians were settling there by the different definitions beginning mid 13th century or so. The mixture of the nations becoming a thing with the modernization and with the 18th century and 19th century rolling in, and economy rising, and people are coming. So this is how this patchwork of people appear. It's as simple as it's a product of modernization. It's a product of people seeking for more land to work on. And unlike the Wild West, there were almost no fighting for the land with the local people, because it was basically a place where lots of frontiers was happening. Frontier between Ukrainian Kazakhs, basically Zaporizhia Kazakhs and Don Kazakhs. The frontier between Slavs and Tatars on the south. The then frontier between Kazakh state and Muscovy. And there is also good book by one of advisors of mine, Hiroaki Kuramiya, called Freedom and Terror in Donbas. And this is basically essentially the best book on history of Donbas ever written, period. And usually borderland is as space of conflict as space of opportunity. And for some people, there was a rescue place, because this modernization gave opportunities for Jews to whom Russian Empire came in late 18th century by divisions of Poland, to have some free place and not appear not stay in shtetls, in the small Jewish towns. For German Mennonites to find their place and to have some rest from being hunted by other religious groups. To Crimean Greeks to find to have their place and their place of religious freedom, and etc. And it also goes to criminals. It also goes to those people who was like hiding from law, both physically running away and hiding underground.
Valeria, your Russian language, Ukrainian, Russian-speaking Ukrainian, is that right? And Yevhenii, are you originally, what was your first language?
I usually say that I have three first languages because when I was a kid, my mom was reading me in Ukrainian, my father was reading me in Russian, and one of my grandfathers was speaking in a weird mishmash of Russian and Yiddish.
That's fascinating. And I also I guess our question to you, and you also write loads about it on Twitter as well, which I was reading before we jumped on this call, that essentially I think the way that I see sometimes language in Ukraine covered in a lot of Western sort of media communication. I'm not talking about more sort of in-depth Western studies on the region and so on and so forth, but just Russian speaking Ukrainian, Ukrainian speaking Ukrainians. And it's just this almost weird, people put it in such black and white terms that it really pisses me off, because when they do that, I don't know where I personally stand, if that makes sense, because I'm half there, half here, and it just it's almost people deny me my own Ukrainian identity by really boxing people in. So I just wanted to ask you a little bit about if you could explain to our audiences and everyone listening a bit about language, and maybe language in Donbas, but also more broadly, and where we are at now in terms of understanding language in Ukraine.
Yeah, because you said many times that the story of Russian language domination in, say, Eastern Ukraine is also a perfect story illustration of the colonial legacy that Russia left Ukraine with, right?
It is not just a part of blunt colonialism, and we just say, oh, this is a spectacular example of colonialism. No, it's more complicated, because it's tied up with the modernization process, with the growing of the urban centers, with the changes of the changing of the temporality, with the changes of the local identity, creation of the local city and identity. And if you look at the Donbas cities of 20s and 30s, for instance, and you will see a very uneven picture. You will not find that all of the people are speaking Russian, or you will not find that all speaking Ukrainian or Yiddish. You will find the very regular for Eastern and Southern Ukraine situation where people are speaking whatever language. And for instance, in 20s, during the colonization process, this for those who don't know Soviet history, it was moment in the early Soviet 20s, where basically till 1927, 29, depends on the country, when there was an order to build up the national language in every Soviet Republic, and in Ukrainian Soviet Republic, it was the case where Ukrainian becoming the main language of the country. And for Donbas particularly, this was a very interesting case, because some of the people in the cities were coming not from primarily Ukrainian-speaking regions, or not from the regions where Ukrainian was taught in schools. And for them, there was a hard times. Like if you read 1922 newspapers, something like Luhansk Pravda, the main newspaper of Luhansk at that moment, it will be in Ukrainian, and it will be in very grammatically bad Ukrainian sometimes. But the thing is, and the problem here is that it's not because people were forced to forget the language. It's particularly because modernization forced lots of people into the urban centers, where they were from everywhere. And because it was Russian Empire, and then it was Soviet Union, lingua franca, the common language, was becoming Russian. But as soon as you go out from the urban centers, you will hear people speaking Ukrainian, or they speak in the mishmash of languages, or they speak in Yiddish, or they speak in Tatar, and this is, or they speak in Greek, for instance, in Mariupol. And this was the part of the this inheritance of the modernization, the full-scale Russification, also in Donbas, started to happening after the Second World War. Because the demographical composition of the region and of the, to be honest, of the whole Ukraine, of course, we know this changed dramatically.
Yeah.
And we had, and after that, actually my family, both parts of Jewish and Ukrainian parts of my family, switched into Russian, particularly in 50s. My grandmother got her doctorate at the Luhansk University, then Varoslavgrad University, in 1950, and it was all in Ukrainian. When she got back to teaching in her hometown of Ravenki, it's like 50 kilometers south from Luhansk, her school where she was taught in Ukrainian in 30s and early 40s was already Russian.
I'm not a historian, and for example, my realization of the fallout of Russian colonialism in this region came from personal observations, because like even in my own family that comes not from urban settlements in Zaporizhia, but from villages, I was growing up seeing that my grandparents and my parents would speak Ukrainian, and then in some certain situations, and when they would get to the city, they would start speaking Russian. And my parents were the first generation of from in their family that switched to Russian as a primary language, and I was, seeing it as a kid, and I was always wondering why it's happening. If you were born speaking Ukrainian and everybody speaks Ukrainian with behind at the dinner table, and then suddenly you have to present this completely different version of yourself in the city where you have to speak Russian or sound very Russian. And only by realizing the reasons behind it, I kind of personally got into the realization of the impact, the depth of the colonialism and what damage it did to our region. And I feel like, I think you said it, maybe I'm mistaken, but nevertheless, that because of the power, because of the depth and the power of Russian colonialism and what damage it did to eastern, southern Ukraine, people from those regions have the most capacity and the most right to speak about Russian colonialism exactly because of that. Because in our lives, through our family histories, we know what it did and how it did it. So in your case, in recent months, as a person who's coming from eastern Ukraine, seeing especially these days how our cities are being flattened out completely, has it changed in any way what it means for you to be Ukrainian these days, or maybe you realize something new, or it stays the same as it was before?
For me, the main thing changed after in the last 3 months. It's I would say it gave me more power to express what actually I'm thinking of, and gave me courage to shake off lots of things I've been actually promoting, and by saying that we have to realize how different the difference of the different people of the people in the eastern Ukraine, and we have to be respectful for me right now, Russian language is not anymore of a language of culture or a language of science or a language of anything valuable, as well as the region itself and the people of there they are suffering for years, and we knew this. And for me, each travel for every place, like it's a coming home, and the things I loved the most before it always been field work in Luhansk Oblast. So yeah, for me this situation it has an unbounding effect. It has an effect of liberation and effect of empowerment. This is the main thing, and I believe this is the main trope every Ukrainian has to bear with us, because last year, like it's very simple thing, also historical, but I want to wrap this up here. Last summer, we all laughed about this Putin's publication on historical, how it's called, historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, something like that, which is supplied the mythical basis for Russian war propaganda, as we now realize it. And we have to understand that, like, this essential idea that Russia has the right to Ukraine because of this, because of that happened, I don't know, 1,000 years ago in Kiev. At that time, the city was trading hub for Viking slavers who were gaining the dominance over local Khazars. It takes fanciful thinking to see here a reason for Russia to invade Ukraine in the 21st century, and it's seen and the preparation it took, and the absurd particulars thoughts are less important than the principle. And if countries can claim other countries on the grounds of millennial myth, the modern state system will cease to exist tomorrow. And for us, taking the responsibility for our culture, for our past, and for me, honestly, and people who know me knows that's like I'm a very boring and person when it comes to detailization of the history, because as I mentioned, like I really don't like half done work, and that's why it took me some weeks to do this thread, because you have to not just be proud Ukrainian, you have to bear responsibility, because right now the whole world is watching at you, and and even in Europe, those people who maybe not really fond of what's happening or what people do or not do,
they're listening.
They looking at you with admiration.
Amazing. I think your answer is also different to some of the answers we've had before. I think it's so important to know what you said, which is that we have more responsibility than ever to, as you say, spend time and energy to really provide people with well thought out research.
We need to build an expertise. We need to build an expertise, and not just be the person who say, "Oh, go read Timothy Snyder or go to read Chiraki Crimea." Like, of course, but
absolutely.
It's also important for us to be people who say, yes, we thankful for all the intellectual support for the build-up, but in fact, what
the work that we need to do ourselves.
They holding the door for us.
Come back to Ukrainian Spaces again. I think this is it for us today. Thank you so much for joining us. This was truly fascinating, and I hope for those of you listening, it was also a different perspective than one we've brought to you yet. I think I really enjoyed really focusing our time and attention on talking about Eastern Ukraine. And I am just really grateful for both Yevhenii and Maksym for today's Twitter Spaces, Ukrainian Spaces podcast, wherever you find us and listen to us.
Yeah.
So thank you so
and
much.
Please support also us on the Patreon page as well and become sponsors. This is, I think that's all apart from one thing is Slava Ukraini.
Heroям Slava, and see you next time.
Bye, guys.